good. But I'll kind of try to, I included a lot of stuff there, and I'll kind of try to just focus in on a few things because, you know, to me, like as I understand it, the goal of this is to kind of expose folks to the different kinds of things that are happening across campus and the different kinds of folks that are doing them. So today you get me. Great. So. So I should have just had you make this slide because I thought I would share a little bit, and luckily we're on the same page. Like we said that we're saying the same things. Yeah. Yeah, so you already heard where I went to school and all. You heard about some of my credentials, which if you ever want to have a talk about professional credentials sometime and the pros and cons and sort of how industry and government and groups like that sort of view that, that would be another great conversation to have. I'm a pretty strong advocate for these kinds of things. I'm a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, which has been around for, gosh, like 60 years or something like that. I'm also a GIS professional. I have that credential, which has been around something like 10. And so those two credentialing organizations, they're viewed very differently, just because one is so new and one has been around for so long, and sort of different viewpoints on the value of that. I will say this again, and I think it's important to share. If you ask me, you know, what I do, some days I will say geographer, some days I will say community planner, and some days I will say information scientist. One of my newest hats that I wear, and I always have to wear a hat because you can see, oh, that didn't get the joke. That didn't get the applause I was hoping for. One of the newest hats that I do wear is as associate director of the School of Computing, a new interdisciplinary school, in some ways similar to School Energy Resources and Hub School on campus, in that trying to take kind of a cross-cutting set of tools and methods and disciplines and make that more accessible and available across the campus. And so I find myself kind of putting things in the context of computing a lot more these days, and I'll kind of talk about that at the end as it relates to some of my rural work. I thought it might be interesting just to mention, like, I had to think about it, like, oh, Jeff, what kind of methods do you use, or what kind of theories do you buy into, right? And so I thought, well, maybe I'll write that down. So, of course, GIS and different kinds of geospatial technologies. I don't always like having to test hypotheses, so I'm kind of a fan of abductive reasoning and looking at data and looking for patterns and then kind of trying to find, you know, the intuitive thing that seems to explain it. So I like abductive reasoning. I like mixed methods kinds of approaches. So I'm probably more qualitative than quantitative, which is a little different for a GIS person. I like working with people, so participatory process, and oftentimes trying to use technology to help enable and facilitate that. And then I don't know, I'm more of a pracademic probably than anything, which maybe if I had to pick a theory that I would sort of ascribe to, maybe it's some of the aspects of pragmatism philosophy. So kind of in, which I know you don't know who this is, but Gilbert White, a geographer, kind of going back to the 1930s, it's really responsible for our whole floodplain mapping kind of philosophy in the state. That was sort of his way of approaching things, very applied, kind of what works, what is the best solution kind of a thing. Sociotechnical systems, and really like being able to apply this in policy and whatnot, so kind of action-oriented research. So you already heard about all my areas of interest. So I won't say too much there, although I will mention this acronym on the second one, because I use it in quite a few slides. So when I use the acronym ICT, I'm referring to information and communication technologies. So that might be a mapping app that you have on your phone. It might be a full-blown GIS. It might be a drone. It might be a sensor in the middle of a stream. So ICT is something that a lot of my work has sort of revolved around. And actually, what are some of the barriers to us using that technology and continuing to use it, right? So there's a lot of great GIS tools out there, and they're put out there for land managers and planners and whatnot, but a lot of times they don't get used, or they don't get used nearly to the potential. So that kind of interests me. And then a bunch of other stuff, including work in Australia. And so excited about the talk next week as well. So I've been around campus for a long time. Started out working in water. You heard about some of the courses that I teach. I do work in Australia, and that's been a long time thing. I've helped kind of really build the Geographic Information Science Center into really a success story of kind of some federal investment that happened in the late 1990s. And now helping to launch and establish a school of computing, particularly figuring out ways that computing can connect in the social sciences and humanities. And then I'm also part of the current EPSCoR project, which Corey is one of the co-PIs on, the WIAC, Wyoming Anticipating Climate Transition, and specifically there I work on the scenario planning. And you already heard about my Hob connections. You like? Yeah, so in the past, I was a senior advisor to the Ruckelshaus House Institute, and so I think our Ruckelshaus House director is online. So looking forward to continuing exploring ways to connect with Ruckelshaus House. I had, a cool thing. I got to be part of the film festival with Maggie in the back, co-teach. Co-taught the Exploring Queensland's Human and Physical Landscapes field course, which has been super fun. Got to go to the Grand Canyon. And the best thing, it isn't really the pancake breakfast. Now I saw there's like kind of an artistic drawing this time, but so yeah, so what's that?
It's next Friday.
Oh, it is next Friday, yes, at, I don't remember what time. The poster's on the door. Yeah, so super excited to have been so closely tied to Haub, and it's been really great to see how the school and all of its programs have really grown up. Really, like, is it 30 years now? Something like that? Like right around 1994, 95. Yeah, so very cool. Okay, so back to what I'm supposed to talk about. So this idea of rural. So I was saying to Corey, it was really great last night because when you get invited to do things like that, it does sort of force you to put everything else aside and just think a little bit, right? And do some thought work about some things. And one of the things that I think about, admitting Drew. Oh, no, that's okay. No, that's great. So one of the things that I kind of think about sometimes is like, where does this idea of rural fit in on some of, well, in academic research, in practice, and how is it different, say, in a setting like Wyoming versus if you're doing like international development kind of work, or something like that. What is it like when you're in a place where you don't have like a community planning program, for example, right? And so I think about this because it's my background and it's part of my perspective on thinking about things in Wyoming. And so then I think, well, it seems like whenever we hear about rural, it's like the ag economists, which are great folks, and they do like community development kind of stuff, right? And that's cool. And then it seems like the other place you hear about it a lot is like in sociology and rural studies and rural sociology, and sometimes crossing over into health and different things like that. But the folks that I identify with a lot is kind of being trained as a planner and having worked as a city planner, community planner before, is that oftentimes like the planning discipline, they don't really talk much about small towns and rural places, right? It's all about cities. It's, you know, the degree is always usually like urban planning, right? You know, and you don't hear about those non-urban places, right? And if you do, they lump it in with economic development or community development, and you're not really talking about, you know, things like resilience and sustainability and different things like that. That's just sort of my experience and my observation. Maybe I'm totally wrong. And I'm sure there are, you know, places where this happens. But I think rural sometimes gets the short end of the stick. And so then I kind of ask, well, are there places, you know, where we can build capacity and sort of thinking about just the uniqueness of rural places, right? What makes them unique? What makes them different? What makes them special? And why should we care? And particularly, we should probably care in a place like Wyoming, right? Even though most of the people in Wyoming live in a city, there is a lot of things happening in that ex-urban part of our landscapes, right? And then just because I do technology, I started to ask, well, like, there's been this digital revolution in a lot of parts of society and a lot of aspects of our lives. And we talk about this a lot of times in cities, right? But we don't really talk about technological innovation in how we live in small town places, right? And so I think about that a lot. And so I thought I would talk about some of that today. And I pause for dramatic effect and to see if there's any questions and to see if that sounds good. Okay, still with me? Still awake? Okay. And so, like, you know, just to kind of look at this, and this is just kind of reinforcing what I said, like, if you look at environmental science programs, environmental studies, natural resource management, you don't often see like rural in there, right? And I picked the other UW because it like came up in the Google search, but and plus it kind of made my point because there's really nothing here about rural in here, right? When it's talking about environmental studies, environmental science, things like that. And that's not to say that people at the University of Washington don't learn about rural places, but it's not sort of a framework that gets used a lot. And I would say the University of Washington is not unique in this particular case. Well, so there's some different ways you could look at this, right? So maybe if we looked at a socioecological systems framework, maybe there would be a little bit more of a space to consider rural places. And so if you kind of look at this diagram, there's the human systems there, and there's the action interventions, but it's like very much sort of primary productivity kinds of things like logging and fishing and farming and things like that. But that community place, that built environment part is not really there. And maybe we get at it with working landscapes and thinking about how rural places are transitioning to have different sorts of mixes of functions happening. And it's good that Drew is joined now because I think he looks at some of this, not only sort of in ranch and farm landscapes, but also in communities as well. So send me some notes, Drew. But yeah, there isn't oftentimes, you know, in an E&R kind of like learning setting where we talk a lot about rural, and maybe we do, and we just don't call it that. And so also last night I was thinking about, well, maybe it's just sort of this idea about the built environment. Like a lot of us get into environmental science and environmental studies and environmental management because we're thinking about things like water and wildlife and energy, but we're maybe not thinking so much about the infrastructure that enables people, humans, being in these spaces as well. So anyway, that's what I was thinking about last night. And so to, you know, after I thought about it a while, I'm trying to think positively about it. Well, so what are some of the opportunities to sort of maybe better understand this idea of, let's call it rurality, right? And then maybe the opportunity is that we really need to be multidisciplinary in the way we think about it. And environmental science, environmental management are very much that way too. But let's really think about applying that to this idea of rural. And and thinking about, well, sometimes it's the geographer's perspective, sometimes it's the sociologist, sometimes it's the planner, sometimes it's the economist, right? But really be deliberate about thinking about trying to sort of pull all these different ways of considering rural together. And I think it would open up some real opportunities for using this, if you will, as a lens in doing some of our work. So how might we broaden that way that we think about and study rural places? How can we enable more work like this here on this campus? So I'll talk a little bit about those two things, and then just kind of end a little bit as kind of a techie geographer to share a little bit about an idea that I'm exploring called smart rural places and digital twins. Oh, I'm almost out of time. Okay, I'll try not to. So when we're thinking about rural, it's one of those things that's kind of hard to define, right? You would say that Wyoming is a very rural state, but again, I just said, and I think it's accurate, most people in Wyoming live in cities, right? And so does that mean we're not rural? So it's tricky, right? And so sometimes we use something called this urban-rural continuum, where we sort of gauge the level of urbanness and ruralness based on things like population density and proximity to big urban centers and kind of a mix of those two factors and some derivatives of that. And then we use words like metropolitan and micropolitan and exurban and peri-urban, and the Australians will use peri-urban. Yeah, and so we try to give these labels to these different things, but the labels are one thing, but then the definitions aren't very cut and dried or black and white either. But I was also kind of encouraged by this, because I went back and I looked at something that I'd been aware of in the past, and it's something called the rural to urban transcript. And this was developed in the early 1990s by an architect by the name of Andres Duany. And at about that same time, there was a real push to get back to sort of increasing livability in places through form and design, I guess. And so that was this idea of new urbanism. That, you know, we have sidewalks, even in the suburbs. We have front porches on buildings. We encourage mixed use. And one of the kind of defining pieces of new urbanism, but also kind of a criticism, is very much about like physical form of the place. Nevertheless, people still buy into new urbanism today, and there's some really great things about it. If you ever saw the movie The Truman Show, you may ever see the movie The Truman Show. So the town that he is in, where he lives in that bubble, I think it's called Seaside, maybe something like that. It's in Florida. It's a real place. Duany was one of the three architects that worked on and designed that particular community. And if you sort of watch the movie again and look at some of the characteristics of the neighborhood, it like has all the hallmarks of new urbanism. So you're getting more urban planning and urban design than you ever thought you would in our class. But that's the whole idea about multidisciplinary, right? And so Duany came up with this idea of this kind of urban to rural transcript, and he tried to sort of show that, you know, there is this continuum, and that you can have sort of these different, I guess T is translate, these sort of different ways of characterizing, you know, space across a landscape based on different characteristics of built environment, if you will. So it was even kind of cooler to me last night. It's a good night last night. Was that I found some folks talking about that, well, you know, like Duany, he didn't just come up with this on his own, right? So he was sort of standing on the shoulders of a bunch of other folks, right? And so, anybody heard of the Garden City movement? So early 1900s, late 1900s or late 1800s, kind of this movement to have healthier, more livable places that were getting away from the kind of the dirty, smoggy, industrial cities of England and Wales and Scotland, if you will. And so if you look closely here at Ebenezer Howard, as the Garden City guy. So it's a group of slumless, smokeless cities. And really, in a nutshell, it's about building green space and taking the natural environment into account as you design the build space. Right? And others built on that. So he was kind of, I don't know, engineer maybe. Patrick Geddes was a sociologist, I think, and a planner, I think. So he built that on that idea. And then design with nature, anyone? Heard of it? Hard. So Ian McHarg, landscape architect, so yet a different discipline as well, wrote, if you think like Silent Spring is kind of an environmental book of the 60s, I would probably put Design with Nature, maybe not quite as high as that in terms of influence, but pretty high. Looking at Maggie. And what was really impactful for me as a geographer here is that basically in this book, and it's been reprinted quite a while back now. Basically, Ian McHarg advocates for the use of GIS overlays, design and environmental planning. So he has the garden city concepts, he has the consideration of landscape and the environment in there, but he also starts to bring in this. So for me, that really resonates. As he did it, it was all like transparencies that were laid on top of each other on a light table. It was not digital at all. But it's basically a GIS book. And so Dewani, with this kind of idea of trying to define rural, really brought in these things that weave their way in and out of environmental history, environmental science, environmental studies. And so there is a connection with some of these things that are more sort of in the realm of geography and planning and environmental science. And so a couple years back, there was a great blog entry at the American Society for Landscape Architects. The blog is called The Dirt. And the column is The Case for the Rural to Urban Transect. And it was written because Dewani wrote a book like 30 years later called Transect Urbanism. And one of the things that really struck me, again, last night, as I was thinking about this, was this little quote in the blog. Dewani's transect's extension of the McHargian, McHarg Design of Nature, protocol yields arguably two of its greatest wins. Its potential to unite environmentalism and urbanism, and its capacity to support diverse, equitable communities. And so it was at that point last night that it's like, oh yeah, okay, I can come and do this talk tomorrow at ENR because I'm finding a way where rural fits in ENR. How's that sound? Interesting? Thoughtful, makes you think a little bit. But I think the point with this, remember what my next slide is. Oh, I'll get to this. The point with this is that by kind of bringing in these different perspectives side of the sort of traditional boundaries of the disciplines that happen to choose to study or like all of a sudden you realize all these connections with sort of maybe a different vocabulary, a slightly different starting point, but they're all kind of getting at the same thing. So I was feeling good about rurality and geography and technology. And you see this continue today. And so now there's this kind of synthesis field that has developed which goes by the name of geodesign. There are no geodesign journals. There is a geodesign conference. There's some geodesign special issues if you go out there. But it's very much an interdisciplinary group of people from architecture at that building scale, to landscape architecture, to engineers, to geographers, all kind of tied together by technology. And the technology hook here is Carl Steinitz was at the Harvard School of Design in the 1960s. Some of the early work of GIS was happening. One of his students was a guy by the name of Jack Dangerman. Jack Dangerman came from a family who owned a tree nursery in Redlands, California. He decided he wanted to be a landscape architect, and he came away being the founder of Esri, the company that we have ArcMap and ArcGIS and everything else from. And so there's this kind of connection between Carl Steinitz, 1960s trained landscape architect who did like design with nature kinds of thinking, and this person who, you know, owns the biggest global GIS software company in. And what's kind of evolved out of that is just sort of a methodological approach to sort of doing design science, if you will, across a wide range of scales, whether it be at a building site or a watershed or an ecosystem. So to me, it's really interesting sort of how, again, that multidisciplinary nature of what we do and how we interact has led to this new thing called geodesign. And so does that help us? We're thinking about rural, right? And so, so the fact is, urban-rural relationships they're messy and they're complex and they're hard to sort of get at. And if you look at these different sort of examples of different characteristics of linkages between urban places and rural places, there's a lot of stuff there that we could study probably for a few careers if we wanted to, right? And so that's what some of us have been kind of wanting to explore. And so how we're thinking about going about this is last fall, a bunch of faculty from across campus had an opportunity to participate in an idea lab setting put on by our research office here. And long story short, what emerged out of that was some support to establish 3 new centers across campus under our Science Institute. Science Initiative, that's what the building is called over there on 9th and Lewis. But I think it's now been rebranded as Science Institute. And so Corey and myself and Melissa Bukowski, and I'll show you the other folks that are on there. We were interested in this idea of community resilience in particular and adaptive capacity. And some of us were interested in the innovation piece as well. And so we said, well, what can we do where we could create a space that would enable work in this area? And so I can tell you, I think this is the first group I've talked about this publicly with. And so launching in fall 2024, by the weather today, it's maybe fall now. We're about a month away, maybe from launching, but at any rate, this is a new initiative on campus. There's a lot of text on here because I'd never made a slide that summarized the new center before. And so when you don't put the time in that is needed, it's not going to be the best slide that you've ever done. But our vision is to focus on innovation challenge areas, including sustainable, resilient growth and continuity, rural-based technology innovation, and regional rural-urban interdependence, agency, knowledge. I won't read the whole thing to you, but yeah, we're going to see how many people we can get to this thing on October 3rd, and by then we'll have a program ready to share. we're kicking this off with kind of an initial 3-year project. And what we want to do with that is to explore creating this, this framework around rural futures, resilience, and adaptation, specifically for Wyoming communities. So it's very much a community focus. And again, it's hard sometimes to define community, right? But we're going to do our best, and we're going to take into consideration some of those things that I just talked about. Part of that will be a statewide integrated assessment modeling effort, which is characterized diagram there. So this is a modeling effort in this lab, kind of looking at vulnerabilities to different drivers of change, if you will. A second piece that I'm going to be looking at is this idea of creating a proof of concept for a smart village. And I'll talk about that in just a second to wrap up. And then doing some education and outreach and technology transfer around technologic innovations that might not always be reaching rural small town Wyoming. I almost feel like I should stop. Just if people want to ask questions, but so maybe I'll just a couple slides and I might skip over a couple. So to me, how many people heard of the digital divide? Yep, a lot of you are digital natives, like you grew up with the technology. There's always been smartphones, there's always been the internet. So that's a generational piece, right? But there's also been a digital divide between urban places and rural places. We're also finding out that really using kind of innovative, cutting edge sort of ICT, information and communication. There's also a smart divide, like get smart cities, you know, that's sort of like, there's a lot of things happening there. Smart rural places, not so much. And so that's kind of the sociological sort of part of this. And that, yeah, a lot of the work that's been around information and communication technology infrastructure is happening in urban places. And I can share these slides if people want, because I'm going to go fast now. And we can sort of look at, well, what are some of those barriers or drivers that are getting in the way of this happening, you know, in small town America as well. Some of them are related to infrastructure. Some of them are just related to things like technology fluency and broadband penetration and things like that, like the network just kind of isn't there. And so there are folks that are interested in trying to understand, like, how do we get over these kinds of hurdles? And so what we're going to try to do with one part of this grant in the first 3 years is like, what kind of sort of GIS-like tools can we create to develop these, you know, what you might call smart rural places? And so a lot of this comes out of Europe, actually. So there have been quite a few EU initiatives over the last 5-6 years on this idea of the smart village concept. And so it isn't just about computing and technology, right? It's about the governance of that. It's about livability. It's about applications like services, tourism, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's like, can we improve quality of life and well-being for residents by applying modern sorts of technologies with like sensors tied to the Internet of Things, right? And so that's what we're going to try to explore. And a kind of a start of that is thinking about, well, how are rural places unique and different? And so again, I'm not going to have time to go into, you know, examples of this. One of the key ones, though, is that top one, is that in urban places, everybody's kind of, but in, did I say urban? That's what I meant. But in rural small town places, like, you don't have that anonymity. Still, you know, utilize and apply some of these technologies to their fullest when, you know, there's a different level of sort of trust and buy-in that you have to think about. So I think that's a really important one to think about as you're sort of something like this. And so kind of the different pieces of it, you know, it isn't just about the purpley technology stuff. To me, it's more about the education and the e-democracy and the people, like what does this end up with in the end? If you're building this sort of smart village kind of idea. And you know, what does it look like out on the ground? It might be something that looks like this in a cartoon where we're able to use things to track things like water quality or air quality or increased traffic because a nuclear power plant is being built in your town and there's 1,000 workers commuting every day from, you know, 100 miles away or something like that, right? So these kinds of things that it might be helpful to have data on. And sort of with that, it's like, can I go back and put on my GIS hat? And can I do something in the realm of GIS where I can sort of model, well, what might that look like for the city of Kemmerer or a gateway community like Jackson or Cody or, you know, fill in the blank, right? There are a lot of our communities in the region that have these kinds of issues. And that might start out small, where it's just a model. We might just call that a digital model. We might kind of advance that along and call it a digital shadow, where we're sort of feeding information into this. Or we might be able to get all the way to a digital twin where we can actually like simulate situations. And then that gets into kind of some of the cool work at WIACT around scenario building and thinking about futures work and then turning around and putting that into the computer. And so, just kind of wrap up. That's kind of part of what I get excited about these days. And hopefully it gave you a little bit of insight into sort of the value of taking, you know, a multidisciplinary approach that it's, you know, have a planning perspective and a geographer and sociologist and maybe a landscape. Along with all the other folks in the gang, and sort of how we can sort of bring that all together and apply to some real world problems like what we're trying to. Out there. Thanks for listening.
Out if you want to, or you can type.
I just currently provide resources for things.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. For a long time, we've supported state government with a lot of sort of data and infrastructure and building logic capacity kind of a thing. But we've done less for local government. And so it's a great question. I was over in Lincoln County last fall and had a conversation with their county. Been there a long time. And while a lot of the counties are pretty good with small little towns in those counties that really have zero capacity. And they almost need data and tools that can operate sort of more at that neighborhood and block and street scale, not like a Sweetwater. So one of the things that we're actually thinking about is how could we leverage some of the funds of the program in the state.
I'm turning on the mics in the audience so that the distance folks can hear your questions.
Have you had conversations or thoughts around how to build the trust and buy-in for that? That was even before you got that slide, I was thinking about that was just how just the feel of like planning and architecture are things that do feel very urban and maybe easier. Big brother-ish and yeah, easier where you do have that anonymity in a city.
Yeah, I mean, I think the approach is very carefully is probably the answer. I was on a walk Monday morning, Labor Day morning, just kind of walking around, and I had to snake my way around campus because roads are closed and stuff, and I came around the corner of the AA over here, and I saw like a robot lawnmower, and it kind of freaked me out. And there's this little like Roomba thing
Yeah.
going up and down the grass hillside at the basketball arena. And like, if I had that reaction to something like that, you're absolutely right. There are gonna be challenges there with that.
I have one from online.
Okay.
Sam asked, how much does zoning law influence the development of the smart village model?
Oh, yeah.
He's a law student.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, because sort of a foundational piece of a smart village is being able to install these sensors, right? And another phrase that gets thrown around a lot with this is this idea of edge computing, that you can actually put a computer kind of in situ out close to where the things that you're monitoring are. So you can do a lot of processing very close to where you're collecting the data and then send sort of like process data back rather than having to send all of the raw data back. That's like a really good question and one that I haven't given much thought to because the very first planning job that I had in the late 1980s, I remember it was right about the time that there were more kind of the first cell towers were going in. And, you know, we have different issues that take place at our city council meetings these days, but back then, like that was like a huge issue that would come up at every city council meeting was something about a cell tower being somewhere where somebody didn't want it. So maybe we need to have a conversation and get some insight on that.
The museum says things.
Yes.
I'm Abdul Ansari from Nepal.
Hi.
And hi. More or less same thing. Firstly, I would like to thank you for your interesting talk. And more or less same thing. We have. I was involved in developing smart villages in Nepal.
Oh, excellent.
Through World Wildlife Fund. I was the project director of that World Wildlife Fund. And just I would like to share something, what we implemented in a smart village concept, right?
Yeah.
So what we did is there is a Chitwa National Park in the center of the country. So we identified the community, indigenous community, which are involved in extracting forest products and timber, boulders, stones, and fishes, something like that from forest as well as from the rivers. So through World Wildlife Fund, what we did is to establish the smart village involving all the people in the different locally available bazaars and activities. So we firstly we provided them with resources to establish community center where we established internet kiosk there. So they get connected through internet firstly. Then we established the homestay. The people like you and other visitors, tourists, they go to Nepal and don't stay at hotels and resorts. They stay at the indigenous people home itself. So they get, income out of that through sighting with the wildlife, tiger and rhinoceros and wild elephants nearby in the jungles.
Yeah.
So that they think that, these are the things we own in the jungle. So
Yeah.
something like that. So, and we also established the English boarding school and also local bazaar, something like that, so that they can extract the fish from the rivers and other non-timber forest products, herbs they can sell, buy and sell over there. And also we established one quality water tank over there. In this way, we are now trying to develop one smart city, smart village, not city, in Chitwa National Park.
Yeah.
So more or less, I think you are also planning to do the same thing.
Yeah.
That's very great to me.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would love to talk with you more about that.
Yeah.
And sort of what I'm hearing there is sort of that investment in infrastructure and innovation has had maybe a lot of like secondary positive impacts. Maybe that you didn't even think about before is sort of what I'm hearing. So that's really cool. Yeah. Thank you.
So in a lot of rural communities, there's a really big culture of like a technological disconnect, right? So how do you go about preserving or like shifting culture in these rural areas when it comes to including technology?
Yeah, yeah. Need to look at my sociologist.
That's a big question.
I mean, I think part of it is understanding values,
Mm.
right? Is a big part of it, and understanding the culture of a place and sort of place identity, I think. And then sort of thinking if there's like an appetite for sort of a innovative placemaking sort of a thing. Like placemaking, I think, came out of looking at public spaces and coming together around that. But maybe thinking about that around sort of some innovation, I guess. And I think it will be different. You know, I remember a long time ago, like Microsoft had these commercials where they were talking about sort of making, was it Lusk or Newcastle? I think, I can't remember. It was sort of like, you know, gonna be this Microsoft town or something like that. I have no idea how that was received or if that was a thing. But it was like, it was an attempt, right? I visited with the mayor of Afton up in Star Valley. So very traditional agrarian, conservative in some ways kind of community up there in Star Valley. The land use is all kind of tied to Mormon agricultural practices and different things like that. But he, as mayor, he worked for a broadband company. And so, and he was a business analyst. And so I think also it's important to have like champions in your community that you know are reflective of that historical culture, but also sort of have this future-looking mindset. And so I think that that idea of having champions that can kind of you know, be advocates for some of this is another really important thing. Yeah.
And I'll just break us because we're at time, but not to say that people can't hang out and ask Jeff more questions and stuff, but I'd love to give you one final thank you, and you're getting lots of thank yous and appreciation online too. So,
Great, thanks for joining online.
yeah, thank you guys. And we'll have a little break in the morning. Thank you all for being here.
Wednesday. This video. And I had a lot of video.
Okay. It's like tonight and tomorrow and
I didn't work there, I was like.
Here. For your office. For my house.
I remember reacting. I don't have anything that is, so do you just want to do it at your work? Or at a coffee shop?
We could do it. I got you.
I figured it was I have not seen it.
So I have, the funding for my position is 50% from the research office, 60% from.
Yeah.
So. It just.
Do you want to talk quick or?
Yeah.
We can also do both.
Yeah, can I just ask you real quick? Actually, very, main. Yeah. Main administrative building.
Consideration would be. Right. If you can light into those questions.
Yeah.
I think it would be that for you.
I'll say something.
I love hearing. Yeah. So, and for like,
No?
how are you thinking about it?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, when he was talking, made me realize.
Good to see you. Well, that was such a great example to share.
Yeah.
You can give them the direction.
I can also share in your class about the whole environment and natural resources scenario.
Okay, yeah, I think, let's
We're
see.
wondering if non-motorized vehicles are maybe going where they shouldn't be, or
Free to share, like,
different things like that. Who's going to which
fully
route?
focus, I think not just in my class.
Or, you know.
It talks about, like, if there's an opportunity to consider all the practice. Because there's also second year students, other people who might be really interested. So maybe we can find
It's funny, just like, John, I'm working on
nine
it.
courses or something,
Oh, great.
or have a special.
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
lecture
that's
presentation,
Yeah.
and then I think also we'll get to the discussion
Okay.
facilitation.
Part
Part of the class.
Part of class for some
Be
people.
like-
Yeah.
But,
Interesting, but,
I have a hunch that you might want to be in the wildlife management or
Yeah.
that component, that topic. And so if we can dovetail that, then you can have like an hour and a half where
once I do figure out.
at least a portion of that could
This
be
is where
your
I'd like to work on
sharing
it.
your perspectives on some.
Sure, yes.
You'll choose an article, that's everybody will read too.
I gotta get over to things like pancake breakfast. Yeah.
I have many assignments to do.
Yes.
Of other portions.
Yes, well,
Wow.
I'll
Yeah.
expecting to see your presentation
Yeah,
on
This
Tuesday.
is really
So-
conclusion, right? How many slides?
Oh, I can,
It's just-
yeah, I can help you too. I think we are so, oh yeah, how funny. I thought.
It's all laid out, right?
I gotta make sure.
I, like,
started on this
3 or 4
one,
people
so
have
we
done it
don't
already,
miss
so
out.
I don't think it's taken, meaning that it shouldn't take you